Welcome to the first in a series of webinars and meetings which form part of the process that Woodlands Ireland is working on to engage stakeholders to contribute towards drafting an updated Native Woodland Strategy for the 2026 to 2030 period. My name is Joe Gowan, CEO of Woodlands Ireland. I'm assisted by Trevor Seary on my left here and Mela O'Brien on my right. Since the previous strategy in 2026 to 2020, there has been a significant increase in native woodland establishment, which is up to around 700 hectares per annum currently. But native woodland conservation uptake has been less successful. The topics today include elements to consider in the formulation of an updated strategy. Listeners may raise related issues in the chat facility here or contact us directly with feedback at any time. A key question is how do civil society organisations and individuals participate in delivering the nature restoration law woodland targets? And just then to the agenda for today. So I'm just doing the introduction there, and then first speaker is Fintan Kelly. We're delighted to have Fintan today from the Environmental Pillar. And his talk is what the Environmental Pillar is doing to inform the design of the Nature Restoration Plan. This will be followed by Declan Cooke from Inland Fisheries Ireland. And Declan will do a talk on a strategy for protective tree covering catchments from an Inland Fisheries Ireland perspective. After that, then we'll have 15 minutes or so. So type your questions into the chat, and we'll then, depending on the number that the questions are there, but we'll take a number of questions. So we'll answer them what we can today, and we will also follow up by bringing you answers to as many of those as possible in the coming days also. So without further ado, I'll ask Fintan to share screen and proceed with his talk there.
Okay. Thanks for having me on here, Joe. As Joe said, I'll be speaking a bit about what the Environmental Pillar is contributing to the Nature Restoration Law Plan development, and I'll be obviously speaking particularly about the native woodland elements and the elements that are relevant to forestry as well. So I suppose myself, I'm Fintan Kelly. I'm the Senior Land Use Officer with the Environmental Pillar. So the Environmental Pillar is a network of almost 40 national NGOs. So we work in collaboration on issues like policy development and advocacy as well. I've been working in the NGO sector in Ireland for about 14 years. For a lot of that, I've been working on, nature policy and forestry policy as well. I sit on the Forestry Strategy Consultative Committee, and I sit on the Independent Advisory Committee as well for the development of the Nature Restoration Plan. So some of the things I'll be touching on today, a bit of a high-level overview on what the Nature Restoration Law is, the role of native woodlands and forestry within the Nature Restoration Plan that Ireland is developing, a bit about how you can get involved, so the public consultation, and then as well, just a bit as well on one element of what the Environmental Pillar is contributing to the development of the plan. So the Nature Restoration Law itself, in my opinion, it's probably the most ambitious nature law that's come out of Brussels in the last 30 years, certainly since the Habitats Directive was developed. It's ambitious because of its scope. So it looks to restore nature not within just islands of protected sites, but right across the continent. So we're looking at within protected areas, yes, on land, across the marine environment, within urban areas, within rivers, looking to restore pollinator populations, and looking to restore nature as well within farmed land, but also within commercial forestry. So in terms of native woodland and forestry, there's two big elements to it. There's Article 4, which sets targets to restore protected habitats on land, but also the habitats of protected species on land. That's Article 4. And then Article 12 looks to restore nature across forests. So this would be both protected forests, but also forestry. When we're talking about tree cover as well, there's other articles that are relevant as well. So within the urban ecosystems article, there's obligations to protect green space, but also urban tree cover. So this is kind of building on best practice urban design for climate change adaptation, looking to increase tree cover and try to reduce that heat island effect. Within the pollinators targets as well, and within the agri-ecosystems articles, like we're going to have to achieve increasing trends in landscape features. So you're looking at lines of trees and hedgerows within the landscape as well. So for foresters or NGOs working with trees, these are all key articles. So then a bit more detail on the native woodland and forestry elements then within the nature restoration plan. So basically, Article 4, as I said, looks to restore habitat across land. It essentially looks to address the implementation we've got with in Habitats and Birds Directive, where we've had targets to achieve favourable conservation status of habitats and species, but because there was no deadline, we haven't had action. So that's resulted in 90% of protected habitats under the Habitats Directive still being in unfavourable conservation status. So Article 4.1 sets targets for member states to put in place restoration measures that are necessary to improve to good condition areas of habitat types listed in Annex 1 which are not in good condition. And then it sets incremental targets and timelines to achieve this. So 30% by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 90% by 2050. And then it places an emphasis then on Natura 2000 sites up to 2030. So you can imagine designated native woodland SSEs between now and 2030, there's going to have to be a real emphasis on those. So what habitat specifically does this restoration target apply to? There are 3 Annex 1 native woodlands in Ireland that this applies to: the old sessile oak woodland habitat type, alluvial forests, and new woodlands. So I suppose in practice, what sort of things would this imply? For me, this would mean that when we're looking at existing native woodlands, it's necessary to address the key pressures. So this would be things like putting in place management plans to address invasive plant species, rhododendron, cherry laurel, but also address overgrazing by deer. So this for me, I think, is what the nature restoration plan is going to have to outline. Then looking at habitat re-establishment. So this is actually recreating habitats in areas where they once existed to expand those habitat types to get to favorable reference areas. So that's basically the target that the science says we need to get to contribute to overall favorable conservation status. So Article 4.2 requires that member states put in place restoration measures that are necessary to re-establish the habitat types listed in Annex 1 with the aim to reach the favorable reference area. And again, this is an incremental time-bound target where we have to achieve 30% by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 100% by 2050. Now, for me, this habitat re-establishment target is probably one of the most ambitious elements of the entire law, because it effectively requires us to recreate these habitats in areas where they no longer exist, and in some cases to do that at scale. So if you look at the habitats that have these recreation or habitat re-establishment targets over 16 kilometers squared, they fall into 2 categories. We have peatlands like wet heath, dry heath, active raised bog, and blanket bog, and then 2 native woodland types. So again, the old sessile oak woodland and the alluvial woodlands. So these are figures in the column to the right there that I've pulled out of the previous Article 17 report. And that report says that to get to favourable reference areas, so that'll be the 100% target, we would have to restore 389 kilometres squared of old sessile oak woodland and 131 kilometres squared of alluvial woodland. So as many of you are aware, at the rate of native woodland creation we're currently at, we'd be way off those targets. So this is going to really require a massive step change, I suppose, in how we go about restoring native woodlands. So other elements of Article 4 that I think are really important for native woodlands protection and re-establishment would be Article 4.7, which looks at the need to restore additional habitats for protected species. So this would be above and beyond what's required just for those protected habitats I talked about previously. Article 4.10 also sets a target, or at least to try and improve connectivity between, or to shall consider, to improve habitat connectivity between habitat types. So if you think about protected species like lesser horseshoe bat that are reliant on native woodlands, this would require that we restore additional native woodland habitat for that species, and that also that we connect up those habitat patches as well. So then looking to Article 12 and forest ecosystems. So this is looking not just at native woodlands, but also commercial forestry. And this sets some key targets as well. So first of all, there's a target to achieve an increasing trend at national level in the Common Forest Bird Index until satisfactory levels are reached, which are defined within the annexes. So Ireland currently doesn't have a Common Forest Bird Index. My colleagues in Birdwatch Ireland have told me. So this will need to be developed for Ireland. We're also required then under the article to achieve an increasing a trend at national level of 6 out of 7 forest ecosystem indicators. So having engaged with the Forest Service, and they're looking to adopt all of the indicators apart from stock of organic carbon. And this is something that the environmental pillar would support, because we consider that the other indicators would be of better benefit to native woodlands. And these would include to achieve increasing trends in standing deadwood, lying deadwood, share of forest with uneven age structure, forest connectivity, the share of the forest dominated by native species, and tree species diversity. So these are things that obviously things like native woodland scheme, continuous cover forestry, close to nature silviculture would contribute to. But we would also have to set targets, I believe, within more standard commercial forestry to retain more deadwood, lying deadwood, etc. So then what are the opportunities now to be involved? So Ireland had quite, I suppose, an impressive stakeholder engagement processes. There was an independent advisory committee, which is giving high-level advice to the minister. There was a leaders forum, which engaged a broader range of stakeholders. And then there was grassroots engagement through a process called community conversations. Those processes have come to an end, so it's no longer to engage through those, but there will be a two-stage public consultation. So there will be a public consultation on the draft plan in May or June, and then that will inform the draft that goes to the European Commission in September. And then once the Commission give their feedback on the draft, there will have to be another consultation as well, so you get a second go. So I'd say include that in your diaries, that there will be something happening in May and June. So then the environmental pillars contribution, I'll speak very briefly. So the environmental pillar have funded 6 projects which are looking to identify priority sites for restoration for inclusion in Ireland's nature restoration plan. 3 of those are currently complete, 3 of them are in development. Of those 2 that are complete, 2 look at native woodlands. There's 1 project that looks at modelling landscape connectivity for lesser horseshoe bat. That was done by Bat Conservation Ireland, the Native Woodland Trust, and the Vincent Wildlife Trust. And then there's the other project that I was working on with a GIS consultant, which looks at the opportunities to expand and re-establish native woodlands on particularly looking at public lands. And I'll speak a bit about that now. So the majority of our projects have looked at the opportunities presented by public land. So in Ireland, the vast majority of the country is privately owned. The vast majority of that would be small landholdings which are farmed. For certain habitats, it's quite difficult to restore them at scale on private land. You imagine native woodland creation, it's generally small scale. It's in maybe the more marginal areas of farms. So to basically increase native woodlands, connect up the fragments is quite challenging on private land. Not impossible, and we'll have to do something on private land, but public land, I think, is where there is a major opportunity. So 11% of Ireland is public land, 7% owned by Cuilcha, 1% by Bord Namona, 1% by the national parks, and other bits owned by ESB and the Land Commission, etc. So we see a big opportunity in this, given the amount of designated land that's publicly owned, the fact that over half our forests are publicly owned, and so much of our peatlands are publicly owned, and there's also a big area of designated sites that are publicly owned as well. So within the project, what we basically did is we tried to identify existing data sets where we could identify the most important native woodlands in the country. So we looked at the ancient and long established woodland data set. We looked at the Native Woodland Survey, and we looked at the Article 17 reporting on native woodlands. We then tried to identify what we thought had the highest biodiversity potential by seeing where there was overlap between those ancient and long established woodlands and the Article 17 woodlands. So those are the ones that are particularly important for the nature restoration plan. And you can see there in the map that the different categories of native woodlands are highlighted in green. And then the overlap between the ancient and long established woodlands and native woodlands are the dark green with the outline in blue. We then said, where can we address fragmentation, and where's the opportunity to expand and connect up these native woodland fragments? So we did a cluster analysis. So we looked to see where those different fragments were within 500 meters of each other. So you can see here, this was our most important cluster, our biggest cluster, and not surprisingly, it's Killarney National Park. So there would be something wrong if we didn't identify Killarney National Park as being an important native woodland. So then to really see where the biggest potential was to expand these sites, we see where do these big clusters overlap with public lands. So then when we did that, we identified our top 14 sites, so which are our biggest clusters where there is an overlap with public lands. And you can see obviously in Killarney National Park, most of it is within the national park. So not surprisingly, there is a massive overlap with publicly owned lands. There in the map, the light yellow is native woodland or national park. The orange is a different category of public land, potentially also NPWS owned or OPW. And then red there is Cuilche land. So you can see massive potential there, obviously, to look at expanding native woodlands subject to ecological assessment. Our second most important sites is based in East Wicklow, and it covers Glendalough, Claravale, Gleelywood, and the Devil's Glen. So that's our cluster. And what I think is really exciting and it really shows the value of this approach is when we turn on the public lands there. And you can see basically going from the Glendalough SSE on the far left, which is obviously within the native or the national park, the Wicklow Mountains National Park. And then you go across the country to the east, and you can see that a lot of these fragments could be connected up and expanded using Cuilche lands and other types of public land. Of the Cuilche lands, some of this area is considered bioclass sites. So these are areas that Cuilche themselves consider of high nature value. So in a country that is so much fragmented native woodland, the opportunity to expand and connect up native woodland at this scale is quite a rare and unique opportunity. So this is something that we'll be suggesting to the minister and everyone involved that we have to explore. Huge opportunities for native woodland conservation, but also for ecotourism, recreation as well. So overall, we've identified 1,900 kilometers squared of public land adjacent to native woodland. We've identified over 129 kilometers squared of native woodland on public lands. We've identified over 70 kilometers squared of native woodland adjacent to public lands. And we've identified native woodlands that are not adjacent to public lands over 72 kilometers as well. So there's a big opportunity there on public lands. We can't achieve it all on public lands. Obviously, Cuilche will still be carrying out a commercial forestry operations. Private landowners will have to be involved. They'll want to be involved. Civil society organizations will want to be involved on private land as well. So public land isn't the be all and end all, but looking at the figures, I don't think it's possible for us to achieve our targets without really ambitious native woodland re-establishment on public land. So that's me for today, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions later.
Thanks very much, Fintan. That was excellent. Hopefully we'll get some questions in the chat there once Declan has done his talk. And so Declan is going to do a talk which is considerably different, but showing the broad range of issues to be considered in updating the Native Woodland Strategy. So work away there, Declan, now, if you want to share screen.
Thanks, Joe. Well, welcome everybody and good afternoon. It's a beautiful day here in Mayo. Hope it's nice where you are too. What I'm going to talk, Declan Cooke is my name. I work with Inland Fisheries Ireland. We recently established a habitat specialisation unit, which is really a way of sort of formalising what we do on rivers to make them better. It started off as a process of trying to sort of clean up after the arterial drainage schemes, which left rivers really in a very poor condition from a fish habitat point of view. But it's now sort of focusing on other types of river as well. And it's starting to sort of adopt international best practice and investigate really how best to restore habitats, given the constraints that we're under. A lot of development and intensive farming now happens in the floodplains of all our major river catchments. So it's a question of sort of trying to select sites and do the best possible fit of measures that we can implement at any given site to improve the habitat to the maximum possible extent, I suppose, under the various constraints. So I'll move into the presentation now, which is really just trying to explain how trees in the landscape influence the way we do river habitat restoration programs, and how this is ultimately beneficial to fish and biodiversity in our river catchments. So I'll start by just really kind of giving an outline of what the protective function of trees is in the context of rivers. So ultimately, from a habitat specialist point of view, the protection enhancement of river habitat and its structure is really of primary importance to us, although there are a number of other very important services, I suppose, that trees bring to river habitats. I'm sure you're all aware of the role that trees can play in natural flood mitigation. It's been in the headlines again recently, and it will continue to be as we go forward in the sort of climate change situation that we're in at the moment. There's also a huge amount of work being done now on investigating how trees offer a protective function to the temperature regimes in watercourses. And again, with the climate change sort of models that we're observing now, it's really of critical importance to understand how trees will play a role in building resilience in river catchments. I wouldn't say it's any less important, but it's the interception of nutrients and sediment are another critical service that trees provide in relation to rivers. But it's a whole presentation in itself, if you like. I'll touch on it because it's such an important element of the treescape. But it really would require too much time to sort of go into the details of that. Similarly, with how trees have a role in driving nutrient spiraling and the food chains in aquatic systems, and the control they offer for light and photosynthesis happening in rivers is really critical to the functioning of those river ecosystems as well. But again, these are details that probably wouldn't be sufficiently dealt with in the time that we have for this presentation. So I'm going to focus most on the habitat, the flood mitigation, and the temperature mitigation that trees offer in terms of riverscapes. So just to have a basic understanding of how river habitats are created, how they work, we take a step back and just have a quick look at river processes and what they look like, and how trees then ultimately control and influence those processes. So rivers themselves are very dynamic ecosystems. They tend to migrate and move across floodplains, and in doing so, they connect with the floodplain. They periodically flood, they deposit nutrients and sediments in the floodplain. They also then erode and deposit within the channel itself. And this is another critical part of the process, because the distribution of sediments in the river is really what drives the river ecosystem in terms of the life that it supports. It transports that sediment from the erosion site and deposits it then where the energy of the river dictates is most appropriate for the sediment to be dropped out of suspension. But again, I would mention that we are constrained in terms of the habitat we can create and develop, because most of our rivers are constrained by the development in the floodplain. So there are sites where we can allow the river to behave more naturally, and then other sites where we have to use that space to provide more control for the river in critical areas where people live and where businesses operate. So how does the river actually affect these processes of flood, receding floods, deposition, and erosion? Well, effectively what rivers really do is they disrupt, or what trees really do is they disrupt the flow of the river. They slow it down in particular areas, they speed it up in other areas, and this allows for the sort of mosaic of habitats to develop along a watercourse. They influence where this erosion and deposition happens. They also control the movement of sediment, or the bed load of the river as it is moved by the energy of the water. They create then a habitat complexity, which is absolutely essential for these ecosystems to build. And they mitigate against the temperature extremes, which I'll go into in a little more detail later on. So one of the key projects that we're working on at the moment is the Riverwood project in conjunction with the EPA. And essentially what that does is it's investigating how adding large wood to the watercourse itself, not just the riparian area, can help restore habitats for the critical conservation species of fish that we're responsible for looking after. These will be salmon, trout, lamprey, eels. We're finding more and more now that when trees come into play in watercourses, that they're providing very much enhanced habitat for these native species. We're evaluating the relationship then between the riparian zones and the in-stream wood, how the wood gets into the river, what the riparian zone actually contributes, in not only in terms of leaf litter, but in terms of that large woody material, which has a physical effect on how rivers behave. And then we're measuring the response in terms of hydromorphology, the shape of the river, how the river is shaped and reshaped by the presence of wood in the channel, and how ultimately this affects fish populations. And I've just left the website address there if anyone would like to look into that project a little further. As it stands, we have a certain amount of information, the response of rivers to us putting wood into the channel. The diagram on the left is from a study done in North America, and you can see anyone who's interested in their fish species will recognize that most of those fish don't belong in Ireland. But what is remarkable about this particular study is that they've managed to demonstrate the level of improvement in Atlantic salmon stocks, which can occur if wood is placed in rivers in the correct context. From our own point of view, we have a number of studies then, follow-up studies from river enhancement projects that we've already carried out, and they're providing very, very promising results as well. You can see this is a small river in County Sligo where we introduced woody material, which ultimately had a huge effect in controlling how sediment moved through that river system, which in turn then provided additional spawning for wild brown trout, and obviously it provided cover and shelter for the fish during low water periods. Ultimately then it resulted in a big change both in the number of trout there, but also in the population structure, the number of older trout which could remain in the river without having to move to larger water downstream. So moving on to natural flood management. This is something that's kind of outside our immediate remit, but we recognize very much the potential for this type of work to contribute to flood management nationally. So I'm referring now to a study that was carried out by Professor Mary Burke in Trinity College. And she's basically tied in with some people in the UK who are now studying what has happened over a period of time when natural flood mitigation methods were introduced to the River Frome in Stroud, or the Stroud Water as it's called. So in 2014, this enormous flood happened in the River Stroud, and you can see how it's affected properties and the town itself. The only people who maybe escaped the worst ravages of the floods are the people who live in the boats that you can see sort of perched mid-water all along this area, which is obviously the natural bank of the river. So there was a huge amount of rainfall in the catchment over a relatively short period. The water then spilled down into the floodplain, and of course the channel itself didn't have sufficient capacity to carry that water, and so it spread out over the surrounding landscape. The solution this is a river that had been worked on in terms of conventional engineering for many years, and still this flood happened. So there was a big push to try and explore different methods that would maybe help ameliorate these floods in future years. So they decided really one of the main features that they could introduce was really what's generally referred to as friction. Friction does involve a lot of trees falling in the river, trees planted along the riverbank, and trees used to construct what they call leaky dams. These are obviously, it's suggested in the name, they're essentially block the flow of the river, but not entirely. So the water can leak through, but much more slowly than it would otherwise do. But it also allows for the creation of wetlands. So once you slow the flow of a river in a particular location, depending on the surrounding landscape, that water is then able to flood out into the surrounding landscape. And you can imagine the energy that this takes out of the peak flood. So following these various measures that were put in throughout the catchment, you can see this hydrograph, which is, so the rainfall is in green here, depicts the resulting flood as measured in the hydrograph subsequent to that rainfall. And the blue then is what happened when you had even more rainfall later on in 2016. The flood peak was so much lower. This is the critical area here at the top where it bursts its banks, it floods out, it damages properties. And you can see by implementing these natural flood measures, the effect that you can have on those peak flows. So it's really about reducing the flood peak by 20 to 30%, which is quite a bit. But if you implement small measures throughout the catchments in the side streams, you can get these quite significant results in terms of flood outcomes. So what do they look like? Well, these are just some examples of work that we've been doing and others in Scotland have been doing. So this is a typical leaky dam. It's built across a side stream. It doesn't entirely block the river, but it slows it down enough so that the water can build up behind it and give you that maybe 12 to 24-hour period where the peak flood is delayed and ameliorated to some degree. This one here is the creation of wetlands using the same type of technique where you put in a sort of a woody dam. The flood water then spills out over the riparian area, and it just spills out for a period of time, enough to take that peak out of the flood. So it's about storage and retention of water for periods of time in the catchment. And this is just a sort of a diagrammatic representation. So this is the critical peak flow that you want to take out. Remember that the actual amount of water that's come down the river is responsive to the amount of water that's entered the catchment from rainfall. And so the area under these two graphs is the same. It's just the severity of the peak that you're trying to ameliorate. And it's all done through the building of friction up in the upper catchment, trees, leaky dams, bunds, and the creation of wetlands, which can take that peak out of the flood. This is what it will probably look like on a landscape scale. This is a project that we're working on, which I'll talk about later on in the west of Ireland, the Bale na Brac. So these are sort of mock-ups, I suppose, of what we expect the landscape will look like once we've started putting those trees in and building those structures to try and delay floods. And this is sort of a close-up of the type of leaky dams that we would be proposing for rivers like that. So on to temperature mitigation. Well, we've been doing a significant amount of studies in various catchments around the country to try and figure out where to plant trees, how many trees, what types of trees, what density to plant them at to achieve the best possible outcomes for rivers, both in terms of temperature, but also nutrients, nutrient interception, and the physical benefits that trees bring once they start falling into rivers. This is a study that was done in two rivers in County Meath, the Ward and the Broadmeadow. And what I draw your attention to is this dashed line here is a daily temperature mean taken from the Ward River. The red is the Broadmeadow. Both taken concurrently, moving through the sort of summer months. It was a very warm year. It was a drought year. And you can see in the Broadmeadow, which is pictured here, it has very, very little tree cover. You can see these critical temperature thresholds where this black line is where the temperature is so high it becomes lethal for salmonids. The other lines are really where it starts to cause them to not feed, to not metabolize whatever food they've had in their system, and basically to go into a sort of a dormant state because they're under stress. So all these thresholds are very important in terms of salmonid stocks and how they behave and reproduce and how fit they are to sort of survive in their environment. You can see in the Broadmeadow, on so many occasions, these thresholds were crossed by these temperature spikes as the water dropped to very low levels and the temperature built up. And you can see the difference between the daily temperature means in the Broadmeadow when compared with the Ward, which is a much more tree-covered site and we had temperatures up to sort of 8, 9, even 10 degrees Celsius difference between the two sites during the same periods, just due to the tree cover that was present in both these rivers. Nutrients, we know a certain amount about the interception of phosphorus. We know that the interception of sediment in the riparian area before overland flow reaches watercourses is critically important for maintaining water quality. But when it comes to nitrogen, there's still a huge amount of work to be done. We know that nitrogen is water soluble. It takes many forms, and it can enter watercourses through the water table, through the soil. So it's much more difficult to intercept that, and it would be far too simplistic to say planting trees in the riparian zone will help with nitrogen, but we know it does with phosphorus, and these are two critical nutrients that are responsible for the sort of decline in water quality that we've seen around Ireland. Again, I'll just briefly skip through this. One of the services that trees offers in terms of river ecosystems is the fact that they can convert nutrients from their raw state, nitrogen and phosphorus, into a more coarse organic material that is digestible by any amount of different river invertebrates and fungi, all sorts of organisms that can actually digest these rivers and these nutrients, and then spiral them downstream as the water flows. These produce these wonderful natural river food chains, which are so critical in allowing fish to survive. So our strategy, really, if you can call it such, is really largely based on what we're learning about temperature regimes in various rivers. So this is one of the risk maps that we've carried out on the Erith River in the west of Ireland. You can see here that where water exits a still water body, it tends to be warmer than the river that comes directly off streams at higher ground. And so these are areas of critical risk where, if we are going to try and implement a tree planting strategy, these will be the areas we would first focus on because they're most in need of temperature mitigation. So we have a strategy in the sense that we know now, or we're learning much more about where we need those trees in the riparian zone to provide that temperature mitigation service. In terms of flood mitigation, it's more about the slope of the surrounding land. And again, it's not something that we would directly deal with, but we do have an understanding of where these areas are likely to give maximum benefit to flood mitigation or natural flood mitigation. So wherever the habitat restoration we're doing largely depends on wherever the opportunities present. But these opportunities are now sort of starting to become more clear to us. So we have recently signed an MOU with Coillte, who have large areas of public land, and we have an opportunity there to allow rivers to maybe move slightly across floodplains. We can put we can put wood in these rivers with the help of Coillte and create much better habitat for fish. We're collaborating with National Parks and Wildlife. We have a big project that's hopefully going to take shape in the next year or so in the national park in Connemara, where the Coillte own the land on one side of the river and the land on the other side of the river is national park. So again, we can allow that river to really spread across the floodplain, flood out into particular areas. We can store water in the upper catchment as a result, which hopefully will have a beneficial effect to towns and villages downstream. We are also in the process of signing an MOU with Bord na Móna. They also have a lot of public land, and we're hopefully going to sort of move into sites on their cutaway bogs where we can plant trees, use those trees again to improve river habitat. And we have an opportunity as well, just on foot of what Fintan was saying earlier on, to connect woodlands via riparian corridors. So it's obviously in our interests and the interests of fish to have those river corridors planted with trees. But there are opportunities that I can see where maybe woodlands that have a connecting riparian strip or corridor that they would be planted up, and woodlands can be therefore connected with each other through these riparian corridors. So there's another opportunity that we can maybe discuss further after this workshop. So the Béal na Brac project is just one of a number of projects that we're doing across the country, some large scale, some small scale. The Béal na Brac is worth talking about a little bit because it's a large scale project. It involves several kilometers of river and one single landowner, where we have the opportunity to allow the river to spread, as I said, across floodplains. We can introduce materials, wood, to the river, and we can allow it to sort of flood out into various wetland areas. So we're very hopeful that that project is going to yield the kind of results that we've seen maybe in Scotland. And as a demonstration site, then we can use it to roll out similar projects in other parts of the country. We have another very exciting project coming up on the River Barrow in Kildare, a place called Portmurhan Island. That's owned by Coillte, so we again have the scope to do these ambitious projects really with the rivers. We've completed a project in Devil's Glen on the Bartree River in County Wicklow, and I can discuss that maybe later on if people are interested in it. And there's just another list of projects that we've either completed or are working on at the moment, which are operating on the same principle of wood in rivers, allowing the river then a little bit of space to sort of flood and spread across floodplains and that kind of thing. So the Béal na Brac, this is just a quick look at the map of the Béal na Brac. So it's this part of the catchment. As I said, a single landowner who's basically allowing us to do everything upslope and in the river that we feel we need to do to create a fairly pristine river habitat. We've already done our baseline measuring. You can see here that the hydrograph, which is in blue, it produced these very, very rapid flood peaks. There's no real buildup. The water is not retained in the catchment for any great length of time. But you can see as well, when the floods come, the temperature drops. But in the absence of a flood, you can see again, here's the critical salmonid threshold. You can see how regularly during the summer months, these temperatures peak over that and produce a very, very stressful environment for salmonids. Here's just an example. This would be a typical sort of drought condition view of the Béal na Brac River. You can see the only trees in the landscape are commercial forestry. There's no riparian tree cover at all. And this is why we're getting these massive temperature peaks. But we're also seeing a massive movement of sediment every time the river floods. So by controlling that sediment movement and providing shade for the river, we're convinced really that we can produce much more favorable conditions for salmonids and most other native aquatic species.
Just one minute left, Declan.
Yeah, okay, I'm almost there. Here's just a view of the plan that we have for the river. You can see here we're using trees to allow the river to flood out into little discrete wetlands down through it. We're going to be trying to affect the distribution of sediment so it's of maximum use to salmonids for spawning and purposes and for the invertebrate food that they rely on. But we're also going to be replacing a lot of these commercial forest stands with native woodland. And a bit of a shout out there to Home Tree, who also own a parcel of land on this stretch of river that we're going to be working on. And they're going to be doing what they do best, which is replace these forest areas with native woodlands as well. Now, Portmurhan is just it's the result of a drainage scheme that was carried out on the Barrow in 1932, where effectively what this used to be a very productive spawning and nursery channel for salmon and for Atlantic salmon, and it was blocked off and dried out, and the river was widened. So this is now the course of the river, and this channel has been effectively rendered obsolete for the last nearly 100 years, I guess, at this stage. So we have Coillte own all the land here. There's some very nice native woodland in amongst the commercial trees here too. And so what we're going to do is reflood this and reconstruct a natural habitat. You can see this picture at the bottom here is a picture of the current riverbed, which it's not really a river. It's been completely silted over. But we're going to recreate a river channel there, very much in line with the natural state, which it used to be back in the pre-1930s. And this again is just a mock-up of the plan that we're likely to be implementing here, creating pools, gravel shoals, tree cover, and introducing woody material into the river to allow the river to renaturalize and be of use to salmon again. And finally, I just draw your attention to a river that has kind of regenerated itself due, I suppose, mostly to neglect from a management point of view. This is a kind of a parkland setup where nobody's really been in to intervene in the river. And you can see all those various things I was talking about: sediment retention, the connection to the floodplain, the building of these berms, which then become tree covered and allow the river to braid into several different channels. The fluvial energy of the river is allowed to spill out over the banks. It has really created what we would regard as almost perfect habitat for salmonids, for lamprey, for all the rare fish species. And this is the type of scenario that we're hoping to be able to recreate by putting wood in rivers and allowing the rivers to renaturalize.
That's excellent, Declan. Thank you very much. We have a number of questions in the chat. I'll just start with some questions broadly for Fintan. And we had one from Andy. He says, I've given over 0.25 of an acre to Native Woodland through the 100 Million Trees Ireland initiative. Is this being recorded in the database? And I suppose that is a bigger question. How will private landowners' contributions be counted towards the national targets?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I think it's a good question because, like, the data sets we've used, like the Native Woodland Survey, like they're not totally comprehensive. So the same with the Article 17 data set, ancient, long established woodlands. So I know that there are native woodlands that exist in the landscape that aren't in any of those. So I suppose in the process of designing this nature restoration plan, we really do need more comprehensive data sets. Anyone who's out there establishing native woodlands, I'm sure to reach your targets that we should be looking at including all of that. So it's a piece of work I think that has to be done. Like, how can we improve tracking all these different efforts and ensuring that these things are captured by our nature restoration plan?
Thanks, Fintan. And then a question from Ashley. What measures have been taken to control invasive alien species such as rhododendron and cherry laurel in native woodland restoration sites? And how will long-term management be handled to prevent them from outcompeting newly established native trees?
Good questions. Yeah, I mean, like my impression, just anecdotally looking around native woodlands, is that like across some of the SSCs there has been improved, programs to address invasive plant species. So Declan mentioned their work that they've done, IFI within the rivers in Devil's Glen. But there's also been some really good work done by Quailshire to address invasive plant species there. I know within Clary National Park, there's really good work being done on and really ramping up rhododendron removal and control. So I think under the nature restoration plan, it's absolutely essential that we sort of take these best practice examples and scale them and have essentially invasive plant species control plans for all of our SSCs, and then branching out and expanding into other priority native woodlands. So I don't really see how we can achieve the restoration targets, but also the re-establishment targets. So there isn't much point creating new native woodlands and then allowing them to be overrun by rhododendron and overgrazed by deer.
Yeah, I might add to that, Fintan, as well. Any of the projects that we're doing, that one in Port Murrahan on the Barrow, the first step really to before we put any tree in any river or reflood that channel is the Quailshire have agreed to do a major project on cherry laurel management, same as they did in Devil's Glen. So it's part of any project that we will be doing going forward, is making sure that whatever invasive plant species are there are removed before we actually do the restoration work.
Thanks, Declan and Fintan. And just a question for yourself, Declan, from David. Given the importance of trees for rivers, are there any plans to consult with DAFM Forest Service to move away from blanket setbacks on aquatic zones in the restock element of felling licenses?
There must have been a fly on the wall in our in our recent meetings. Yes, we've had a number of meetings now with the Forest Service, and we're really making good strides now in terms of getting the sort of blanket approach to the setback areas sort of tweaked, I suppose. They're nervous about a complete abandonment of these regulations because, you know, they just want to wait and see that it's not going to be sort of too literally interpreted or maybe taken advantage of. But any projects that we are working on, or National Parks and Wildlife are working on, or which we endorse, I suppose, can be flagged to the Forest Service now, and they will agree to allow a suspension of whatever blanket rules they've previously had with regard to setbacks. So they're allowing a certain amount of native trees to be planted in the setback area.
I think as well, like I mentioned in my presentation the big target for the re-establishment of alluvial woodland. So obviously, if we have a sort of system that doesn't allow the development of native woodlands within riparian areas, that's going to be a major barrier then for alluvial woodland restoration. I do know within the midterm review of the forestry program that there has been more progress made on that alluvial woodland issue. And then another major issue would be that, you know, the fact that we have these alluvial woodland targets, but we have, I suppose, a wing of government in the OPW that's actively engaged in removing riparian woodlands and alluvial woodlands. So I think that's a major issue that needs to be addressed as well.
Thanks, Fintan and Declan. Just a question which I'll give an answer to myself is what training experience should a young person slash ecologist seek in order to be part of the workforce that can be part of the works in the nature restoration plan? Essentially, we think that we need to look at gearing up a workforce to assist in implementing the targets, and to have proper career structures, you know, going from apprenticeships up to your, you know, level 9 qualifications and so on. At the moment, we have a pilot native woodland conservation operative level basic skills training running at the moment. And we're hoping that over time, and we've submitted, and it is in discussion in the Forest Strategic Consultative Committee, a document towards a forestry education and training strategy, which we'd also like to see incorporated into when we, over the next few months, complete a draft native woodland strategy. So along with that, there has to be a education and training strategy, which isn't currently in place. We'd like to see a working group, possibly with the Forest Strategic Consultative Committee, or in any other forum, and we will look for suggestions from listeners and from stakeholders broadly on that. So a question from Catherine, which do Inland Fisheries Ireland engage with acres CP teams on landscape area plans?
We liaise mainly with LawPro to achieve those kind of outcomes. So we don't directly deal with the sort of acres people, but we're aware that LawPro do. We have had we've submitted copiously, I suppose, to DAFM in relation, and Teagasc in relation to the acres when they were in the sort of public consultation stage, but we don't work with them generally on a day-to-day basis. We work with LawPro.
Okay. Now a question that I was thinking myself was how can tree nurseries prepare for achieving the targets without an agreed strategy between public and private sectors, or between the whole of society, if you like? Maybe Fintan, you might have a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive gap. I was saying to before this session started to Joe that I was down at the ploughing last year, and someone from None So Hardy was talking about this issue about the lack of, I suppose, coordination around forecasting. So we've obviously just had a mast year as well of oak. Like I said, we've big targets for old sessile oak re-establishment. So we're going to need a lot of oak trees. We're going to need a lot of different native woodland species. So I think it's essential that that's addressed. It's like many people have said it, not just me, but there's a massive opportunity there to grow the sector nationally through our CAP strategic plan, through our forestry program, and now through the nature restoration plan. And we should be supplying as much of that those trees as possible. And obviously, we'd want 100% of the trees to be coming from local genetic stock. So obviously at a national level, but also at a local level as well. I know that there's members of ours like the Native Woodland Trust that are trying to actually develop local stock. So where they are expanding native woodlands locally, that they're identifying ancient and long established woodlands and trying to grow on the trees there locally. So I think it's a big opportunity for the rural economy, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Fintan. And just finally, I was glad to see in your presentation, Fintan, that you have an estimate that roughly 2/3 of the nature restoration law woodland targets could be potentially achieved on state lands, and that leaves 1/3 roughly from the private sector. Is that kind of correct interpretation of what you were saying?
Yes, I know. So that's a very high level figure. So like we're basically looking at all of the public land that's adjacent to native woodlands, but like there's some huge caveats in that. So if we think about some of our largest Natch 2000 sites would be the 6 hen harrier SPAs, which are obviously designated for hen harriers, which are dependent on open upland habitats. So there's currently a moratorium on any form of afforestation within those sites. So sites like that wouldn't potentially at the moment be suitable for native woodland establishment. So there's a lot of detail like that. So I think that's why I said as well, all of big targets for blanket bog restoration. So there's going to be a certain amount of overlap and competition maybe for space within public lands and our uplands. But I think what the project was trying to get across really was the opportunity broadly. And then I think particularly where we have things like Gaeltacht bioclass sites where Gaeltacht themselves have said, these are publicly owned forests that are of high biodiversity value. I think it's a no-brainer that we would be looking to investigate those, see where they are, could they be strategically restored, or even what's there. So I think there's definitely a lot of potential in public land, but I think we're obviously going to have to look at private land as well. The vast majority of the country is privately owned. I think there's a lot of landowners out there that want to be involved, and I don't think that the state should be limiting the ambition of private landowners or civil society.
Thanks very much, Fintan. So that just brings us to the end of the first webinar in a series where we're looking to get observations and suggestions also from all the stakeholders that are listening in or that will tune in later on the recording. So I'd just like to thank our two speakers today, Declan Cooke from Inland Fisheries Ireland and Fintan Kelly from Environment Pillar. So look out, and we'll post details of the upcoming webinars, which will be in a few weeks' time. So thank you very much for tuning in, and Gormahav Gwiv Galer.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks to yourself and Trevor for organising the webinar. It's been very useful for me.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Slán, all the best for now.